was brought out in the conference. So when the paper was offered on Kelso, I thought, great, I can take a step back from that and something I don't need to do. And the other, for me, and we were speaking about this at coffee, really, really important thing in that paper was stressing network. And that's what I'm going to be looking at in this particular talk. Now, the other thing I'd say is Richard Fawcett, as we've already heard, would probably have done this infinitely better than anybody else. Richard and I worked very, very closely for a long number of years. It's hard to believe it's now nearly a year since he died. And a lot of what I say owes a great deal to Richard's thinking. The key thing about Richard is unless he was absolutely certain of something, he would not float it. That's partly what was being alluded to, because he knew what would happen, like I tried to explore a little bit on Friday night. You put out a bit of speculation, like my good friend Michael has done, and that is speculation, and you can guarantee that there'll be somebody go away from here and it will be reported as fact in the next appearance of that subject for discussion. Anyway, without much further ado, let's move on. What I'm showing on screen there is possibly the only actual early surviving piece of architecture, in inverted commas, that we can probably directly associate with David. I don't put a picture up because it is possibly the most boring Motte and Bailey you're ever likely to see, mostly because it was turned into a landscape garden for the house at the Haining at Selkirk. But the Motte at Selkirk, the centerpiece of David's borough of Selkirk, the centerpiece as well of a designed, intentionally planned landscape that includes his first Tyrannensian abbey. That is possibly David's original caput in his principality, certainly for the Teviotdale portion of his great principality of Cumbria. And there's a tendency to forget this is where it all happened before he moves to Roxburgh. So what we really need to be thinking about, David, is what kind of combination of reasons led to the development of particular places, and how did he gather together the people who put these things into operation? And absolutely, as Anthony is saying, David did not have all of this in his head. He wasn't going around saying, oh yes, I think I will have massive orders for the church that I'm building over here, and this one is going to be Cistercian, and that one is going to be Aruesian. He's eclectic. He has people around him who are saying to him, for your image building purposes, you need to be getting into this lot because they're the ones that have got the ear of the Pope. You want to get a pallium to turn the Bishop of St. Andrews into the Archbishop of St. Andrews, so you need to be sucking up to the Cistercians, big time. That's the way in which David's eclecticism worked. Christopher Brooke referred to it as being a connoisseur of the religious orders. He is actually being a very, very political maneuverer within the religious orders. And he's building networks of power that are built around architecture, the exchange of ideas about architecture, and it is a flow that is all across the British Isles, northern France, into Germany. And remember, exactly as Anthony was saying, networks where his nieces, and it isn't just the Empress Matilda to think about, you also need to think about Stephen's wife, Matilda of Boulogne as well. So there's that network. Then there's his aunt, who is the Abbess of Rumsey. You've got to think about the influence of Henry I and his building projects. We've heard about Matilda, his sister, and her patronage of the orders. But we also have to remember Matilda, his wife, and her first husband. They are critically important in this whole evolution of something. And at no point must you ever think about Davidian architecture. There is no such thing. There is no Davidian style. There is the architecture of David's reign. And that's what I'm going to be looking at. So where does he get his ideas from? Remember, this is a boy who from 1093 had been brought up at what was the most sophisticated court in the north of Europe. The only things that were possibly on a higher order were the imperial court of the Holy Roman Emperors, and then it is until you get to the Byzantine court down in Constantinople before you're seeing anything with the degree of sophistication that the Norman kings of England are building. Now, forget the crappy 17th century roofs on top of the turrets here. This building is one of the things that David would have been intimately familiar with from the 1090s. It's completed by that stage. And this is the building, and he knows what these are for. Now, if anybody looks at it, oh, it's a keep. This is the last place of resort. It's a fortress. That, pardon the French, is utter bollocks. These buildings weren't built to be lived in. These are showcases for ceremonial purposes. They are big, spacious, drafty, utterly impractical for living in. All the suggestions, oh, well, these big spaces would be divided up by curtains and screens and things like that to give you a little bit of privacy. Nonsense! Phil Barker and Pamela Marshall have very comprehensively demolished that, looking at the Norman and Angevin houses. These great towers are the places that you held your big public events, the ceremonies, the the crown wearing episodes, things of that kind. And what you are seeing here is only the kernel of an arrangement. Once they've done the stuff there, including possibly the big public worship in the chapel, they would then remove themselves from that building into the camera, into the chamber, into the comfortable spaces outside the tower. So David is seeing that, and he understands how buildings like that function. So when he becomes Earl, and he inherits all of, and remember, it is his wife Matilda's property, not Simon de Senlis' property. He only got that by marriage. He gets some of these rather old-fashioned sites, Motte and Bailey's. This is Fotheringhay, which was one of his most important residential sites. And almost immediately, he is starting rebuilding work, because he, at the same time as he's getting this, remember, has also become the prince, the ruler of that Cumbrian region. This is somebody who's going up in the world, and he needs to start marking that status. And he isn't living all the time in the borders of Scotland. He's not at Selkirk all the time. He's spending most of his time actually here and in Northampton. And the things that he is seeing being constructed are the ones that we should imagine David as emulating. In the 1120s, his brother-in-law, Henry I, starts the building of the great tower there at Carlisle Castle. He's developing the site here that his brother, William Rufus, had first started to expand as a great castle in the 1090s. Largely a timber construction with some stone elements. Henry I has got big plans for Carlisle. This is, Ranulph has gone off down to Chester. The king takes over the great honour of Carlisle. This is when he starts planning the development of the bishopric of Carlisle, which really annoys David. Because remember, Cumbria doesn't, that little pathetic English region of Cumbria is only the southern tip of the great realm of Cumbria, that it's extending all the way up into Francis's territory and beyond. So what you have got is Henry I proclaiming his arrival, and what does he build? A great tower. And this great tower may not be finished by the time that David takes this place over in 1136, but it is a building that is intended by him. This will be one of the two pivots around which my new realm rotates At one end of the axis is Carlisle, at the other end is Roxburgh. And this is the building that he knows how the Tower of London works. He knows how Norwich works, the Great Tower at Winchester, places like that. This is where David would be holding court. Now, it might not look particularly much now, especially after the Tudors sliced off at least a story and a half off the top of the tower. But this thing would have had a tower that was almost as high as the Cathedral Tower in Carlisle. It was a whacking great statement with neon lights across the top of it that this is where royal power is based. Bare stone now, this would have been lime washed. I know there's still a lot of folk in Stirling don't like the fact that the Great Hall has been coloured and it shines. That's the whole point about the lime washing. It is to draw attention to these buildings. So this is David's new showpiece. The other one that they're getting for Earl Henry is the Great Tower that has been completely and utterly trashed in the 18th and 19th century, again losing at least one story off the top of it, redeveloped by Sir William Armstrong, is Bamborough, the symbolic seat of the Northern Kingdom, if you like. And these are the two pivots that Henry I had constructed for the expansion of his royal power to its maximum northern extension of that time. And David is going to be taking over both of these. So here's Bamborough, the heavily restored tower, but you can still see enough of the original 12th century elements within it to get a sense of the presence that this building is meant to be proclaiming. This is, you know, if you needed any statement of power, this is it. And then we have to look hard to see the same kinds of things in Scotland. You know, it was to the point where if you read McGibbon and Ross, and then if you read through Douglas Simpson particularly, all Douglas Simpson's books should be gathered into a heap in the middle of a room, poured with petrol and a match put to them, because he is one of the worst perpetrators of that thing about floating an opinion, which then becomes, through his own self-plagiarizing, turns into absolute truth. That there were no great Norman-style towers built in Scotland. If you go back to the sources, we know that David built a tower here. We have got reference to the prisoner, Donald MacHeath, being kept in the Tower of Roxburgh after his capture in 1156. So you've got the David Tower here, which remains a key feature of this castle down to his destructions in the Wars of Independence. And very interestingly, Roxburgh here is being developed consciously as the successor site to Selkirk. And this is where royal power, including the moving of Kelso Abbey or Selkirk Abbey to Kelso, this is being developed as the Scottish Carlisle, or the Carlisle that is in that part of England, which is not quite Scotland. But are there any more? And the answer is debatable. Fernie and Cameron both have teased around an idea that the building that we call St. Margaret's Chapel, which has nothing whatsoever to do with her, it's not built until at least 35 to 40 years after she's dead, that this building is the rump of a great tower. And the idea is that you'll get chapels of this kind that may be part of a forework, sort of the entrance arrangements, lower building attached onto the side of the Great Tower. But the thing about this is it occupies the highest part of the castle rock. It's the place where if you were going to be building a great, whacking, enormous tower that's saying, this is my castle site, that's where you're going to build a great tower. And given, as Davy was saying yesterday as well, if you look at the surviving distribution of charters of David I, in secular location issues, more charters issued here than in any other location. This is one of the places where David is choosing to base himself. And it is likely, yes, that he takes over a pre-existing fortified site in the same way as he takes over the castle of Stirling that his brother had been developing earlier on, and probably their predecessors before them. So he's not doing something on a virgin site here. This is an ancient fortified site, but you've got the chapel being put into it. Now, as we see it, this is largely a 19th century, massively over-restored building. And as you look at it, you can start to get all sorts of bits of evidence. I mean, the whole of this corner here has been reconstructed. The reason for the change in stone up there at the top is because that's a 19th century barrel vault that got stuck onto the roof of it. This building was used as a powder magazine for part of its time. But there are changes. You've got this wonderful cubical ashlar work here, and then this rough material down here. So you can look at this building, you can pick out all these different phases. Do we have any clear sense of when and how and what was being constructed here? All we can say with any kind of certainty is that David wanted this to be part of a showcase within his newly established Lothian Centre at Edinburgh. The other thing to look at, forget the barrel vaulted roof, that's the 19th century restoration. The chancel arch, really weird things though, you know, the chancel window off centre, all the rest of it. But the chancel arch is hugely important. Two orders with chevrons, and then you've got this outer fillet round here with lozenge design on it. Keep that in your head. If you're thinking about anything that might want to be David's Edinburgh style, this emphasis Edinburgh style, not David style, this is it. Because not the now destroyed, this is the engraving of the doorway from St. Giles in Edinburgh, the last part of the 12th century church. I'll come to that in a moment. But here at Holyrood, we've got another one of those doorways. Now, just to jump back to this one, what this is telling us, again, in the borough church that is carved out of the much, much larger parish of St. Cuthbert's, there is an enormous investment going on in the construction of a very, very sophisticated Romanesque church. So St. Giles has always been intended to be something special that has been created in David's new seat there. Leave that. Back to Holyrood. Holyrood, now, David was a very busy man in 1128 because Kelso gets established. Dunfermline gets elevated into a bishopric and work starts, not a bishopric, an abbacy, and work starts on the building there. But he also founds this, Holyrood, in Edinburgh. So you've got the monks of Kelso on the one hand, we've got the Benedictines at Dunfermline, and here it's Augustinians. And in the church here, surviving portion, two orders with chevrons, but with a key symbol round the outer order. This is almost, and I'm going to be, this is me emphasizing, almost definitely the same group of masons who are building St. Margaret's Chapel. Not the Augustinians themselves. These people didn't know one end of a chisel from another. You get people who do know. And this is the most important thing that we can start to take out of this, is this is the beginning of the evidence that we have for the type of networks that Anthony was pointing towards. The people that are being brought in from elsewhere. So, what's the connection here? The connection is the first Abbot Alwyn, who came from Merton Abbey in Surrey. These are Augustinians of Merton. But he had previously been an Augustinian put into the Old Minster Church at Great Paxton in the Huntingdon-Cambridgeshire border by David. We're back to Huntingdon, Northampton. That is the hub of David's network of influence. And this man had been David's chaplain before he decided to become an Augustinian, before he went into Great Paxton and then down to Merton and then up to Holyrood. There is a line of development coming through here, and we can see the way that ideas start to percolate in, brought by David's people, not by David. So let's have a quick look at Northampton. This is John Speed's early 17th century map. And as Anthony said, absolutely, this is a place we could weep about the losses. Two major losses. St Andrew's Priory up there, and Delapré is the other one, the great nunnery that is founded late in David's reign. Both completely gone, or at least both of the 12th century ones completely gone. And we can only wonder what the Cluniac Abbey, and everybody goes, oh, David wasn't interested in the Cluniacs. Bollocks, again, because he is the patron of that abbey and he continues to push his patronage towards it. He didn't need to found another Cluniac house because he already had Cluniac houses. That is a likely, and we can only say this, a likely source of influence for a lot of his architecture. Much more important, however, is the church that was founded by his predecessor as Matilda's husband, the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. And we remember Anthony's image of the Holy Sepulchre Church with its round form, with the shrine building standing within it. That is what Simon constructs. He's the crusader. He'd been out there for the first crusade. He saw that church. He came back and he wanted one. So, what, you might say? Smaller scale, this one you can still see. It's there in Cambridge, looking pretty much like it did there in the 19th century. But the building that has left us no physical trace, that is there, though, in the documents, the most important potential Northampton contribution to David's architectural legacy, stood somewhere here in Roxburgh. Roxburgh. You're getting a little link going on here. This church stood beside the main road leading from, this is Roxburgh Castle here. The borough covers this area in here. It is on the road to the Teviot Bridge. It's one of the two main axial routes running through Roxburgh. So, Church of the Holy Sepulchre. And this also makes Roxburgh unique in that it was our only medieval borough in Scotland that had not one, but two parish churches within it. That's David's ambition for Roxburgh. That's the size of that borough. Because the thing about parish churches, as John was talking about yesterday, they need to have the income to sustain them. And over and above that, you've got a third church, which is the Church of St. John in the castle. So there's a place here, a lot is going on architecturally. And of course, 1128, as we've heard, Kelso and Dunfermline are the two big projects. And I'm not going to go into any of the detail here. I was able to leave this out. I've got a few more pictures of them. But the Kelso discussion from Anthony and the Dunfermline discussion from Michael covered the detail of this. Absolutely make the point, though, that Tirongarde is not the inspiration. There is no Tyrannensian style, as we heard emphatically, and I absolutely agree with that. There is no Tyrannensian style. There are certain things that you see influences of Kelso turning up at Arbroath, turning up at Kilwinning, but that's Kelso style, not Tyrone style. The Abbey, the only things I'll say about this is up to that level, so just above the nave arcade, is all laid out in 1128 and built very, very shortly thereafter. So right from inception, this building was meant to have that plan. The upper parts here aren't built until later decades of the 12th century. But sufficient of this was complete for this to be the burial place of David's son, Earl Henry, in 1152. And that, again, gives us another little hint back as to, right, where might some of the influences be coming on? The female influence, very important, although, interestingly, Queen Matilda isn't buried in Dunfermline, isn't buried here, she's buried in Scone. So, dynastic thing, that's an odd one. Anthony, quite rightly challenged. This is the reconstruction of Bury St Edmunds. There's Ely. But there are two other places that would draw your attention to. This is a model reconstruction of a place that probably most of you have never heard of. There's very interesting remains there. This is the richest Cluniac monastery in the British Isles. This was the great priory of St Pancras at Lewes, down in Sussex. And this is Alan Sorrell's very, very famous reconstruction of Castleacre Priory. What is common between them? It's the de Warenne family. Who does Earl Henry marry? Ada de Warenne. And these, Sussex, Norfolk, Suffolk, Cambridgeshire, there, and probably add on to that Peterborough and the lost Cluniac Abbey of Northampton. And there is the territorial nexus of the influences that are coming through in David I Scotland. And Anthony, I just want to add one other thing to you. Matilda, David is using revenues from Huntingdon, Northampton, as the kickstart for the founding. Earls Barton, for example, is providing income for the building work that is going on at Kelso. Money goes to Melrose, money goes to Holyrood in its early stages. But Kelso, if you've not been to Kelso, I mean, just a little straw poll, how many of you have been to Kelso Abbey? That is amazing for me, because the number of times I've asked that question, and you end up maybe with two people saying that they have. This is the most interesting of the border abbeys. You know, that nonsense about Melrose is overblown. Dryburgh is nice enough. Jedburgh is much more interesting. But this is the real one, because this is the most magnificent. It is a unique building. And we should celebrate it far more. And the fact that, you know, we've got 4 years, Dr. Scott, to have a proper celebration of not just Dunfermline, but also Kelso. Now, rightly, we've had the connection as well between Dunfermline and Durham played up. And certainly when you look at the nave piers here, that's the site of the nave altar. The nave altar attention. This is Richard Fawcett was actually the first person to draw attention to this. You've got these very, very elaborated piers flanking the nave altar, drawing attention to the fact that this is the sanctuary area beside the altar. Exactly what you've got in William of St. Calais Church at Durham, where the nave altar used to be located. It is no accident that this is happening at this precise time, because you have got to bear in mind that things have happened at Durham that stopped the building work. 1128, Ranulph Flambard, Bishop of Durham. 1128, Bishop Ranulph Flambard dies. And there is a 5-year hiatus before Geoffrey Rufus. And so you've got all these masons sitting there going, what are we going to do? David, I've got a little project that you might be interested in. And so we can probably say that in 1128, there is a wagon train of craftsmen coming up out of the Durham territories. to here. Now, we should add, it's not just Durham. There are strong similarities to places like Bishop's Waltham as well. Another East Anglian, although it's Essex more than anything else. But you can see networks emerging very, very strongly here. An accident of circumstance bringing people in to complete the work. Some of the strongest evidence, not that outer, that's Abbot Borthwick's porch, but behind it, you've got the 12th century door. The detailing of that door, again, just points you straight to those Durham connections. The elevations in the nave, right to those Durham connections. So the men who are building this aren't folk who just happen to have gone down and sketched things out. It's the same men who are building this. And the detail, especially where the removal of the burial aisle off the southeast processional doorway, that's not recut. That is the crispness that survived because the whole thing had been enclosed in the late 17th, early 18th centuries. You've got wonderful detail, including nice little mask detail down here on the capital. Yep. I've got my time going. Yep. And look, it turns up again here at the church in Edram. Edram is part of that Durham nexus as well. Dalmeny, remember the detail. Remember the detail. So these buildings mark the spread of David's influence through. Jedburgh, I'll move over very quickly, but just to say the monumental architecture of Jedburgh really is part of David's, it's almost like an architectural arms race that's taking place here. This is showing my control. The massive orders here also turn up in places like his aunt's abbey at Rumsey down in Hampshire. Reading Abbey, we now know, had them, but also here in St. Fridswide's in Oxford. But I want to finish with the only building that survives almost complete from David. And this is where John and I do disagree, because David is only really starting to put his personal print into Murray. Yes, shut up. After the death of William Fitzduncan. But the church at Burney, built for Bishop William, who is David's first bishop in Murray, really demonstrates, if you like, the simplicity and purity of the 12th century Romanesque, stripped of all the fripperies, all the showcasing that you've got going on at Cambuskent, at Dunfermline, at Kelso, Holyrood, and the rest of them. This is also what David is after.